So welcome everybody to Voices with Vervaeke. It's my great pleasure to have Mark Vernon on again. Some of you probably had the privilege of seeing the previous discussion I had with Mark, especially connected to the work of Barfield and transformation of participatory knowing. It was a very good dialogue, but I thought I'd give Mark a chance to introduce himself to you guys again, so you can know who he is, where he's coming from. So, Mark, welcome again. It's a great pleasure to have you here again.
Thank you, John, as well. And I'm very glad to come back and pick up some of the themes, perhaps, which we discussed before. But in a way, I want to ask you about a number of things and how you feel they fit in with your work.
Yeah.
But maybe just to say something, as you were suggesting, in who I am. So I work as a psychotherapist. I'm based in London. I have a background in philosophy as well as physics. I did a PhD on Plato. And in some ways, what really interests me, and maybe this is a good way into what I hope to ask you a bit about today. I was very influenced by this chap, Owen Barfield, who we talked about before.
Yep.
And one of his key insights was that the human experience of being alive, their participation in the world, their even perceptual capacities has profoundly changed over time. And I got into this because when I was doing my PhD on Plato, I spent the whole time feeling I didn't quite get to grips with what Plato was talking about. I could sort of make sense of Plato within the sort of logic, if you like, of particularly Anglo-American philosophy. And so I examined this dialogue and I made it stack up, and so I got the PhD. But I felt the whole time that I was really having to sort of strip away aspects of the dialogue in order to make some sense of it, rather than treat it as a whole.
Right.
And it was when I started reading Barfield that I realized what this partly might be about. And because Barfield makes this big point that when you read someone like Plato, you have to be very careful, because it feels a bit like they share the same worldview or life form as you. And in some measure they do, but in important measures they don't.
Yes.
And he actually got at this through words. So he, some quite arresting observations he makes are, for example, you know, Plato just doesn't have words like analysis or like quantity, words which you'd think would just be basic for any philosopher. Certainly a philosopher who's popularly imagined to be one of the most sort of rational philosophers who's ever lived. And then you realize that he weaves things like myth into his dialogues, rituals, invocations are there. There's a whole kind of richness going on. And it's only after reading Barfield that I began to be able to make some more sense of this, particularly through this idea that our consciousness, you know, meaning our perceptual capacities, do radically change over time. Now, Barfield developed a kind of, there's a reason for this, in the sense of there's a sort of unfolding or purpose, which would be one way of taking it. But the thing I sort of was thinking about after we spoke last was, in a way, can some sense be made of these changes through thinking about the notion of spiritual intelligence, and whether the idea that there's a kind of spiritual intelligence that, say, is different from other kinds of intelligence, certainly different from artificial intelligence as it's normally conceived. Now, I feel nervous at this point because I know that I'm speaking to someone who's very much at the vanguard of expanding the notion of artificial intelligence. But you know, that's why it's good to speak to you.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's also a real question, because I'm partly involved in a project at Cambridge University, and we're working on how artificial intelligence tends to sort of eliminate various kinds of intelligence which are actually basic and we use all day, every day. But spiritual intelligence, if we can define such a thing, would be the kind of the outlier, that would be really important to try and get hold of if we can. Yeah. So anyway, so that's something of what I wondered if we could talk about today.
This is fantastic. Oh, wow. What a great setup.
Okay, well, let's see how it goes.
Well, so first of all, I want to address both of these. And I want to address them in the situation you did. So I'm actually on somebody's area committee who, I'm the external examiner, and he's doing work basically tracing the connections between Goethe, Barfield, and Steiner. And so this is uppermost in my mind right now, and sort of putting that into dialogue with cognitive science, I think, is really important. But so one thing there's two things that come up with that, Barfield's particular argument, and then the more general claim that we can, that there are, deep fundamental changes in what I often call the cultural cognitive grammar by which people make sense. And so I want to talk about that. That's great. And then, as you said, this idea that because of our particular history and our particular default mode, which I would typify by what I call the Three Manos. It's a monolithic mode in which all knowing is reduced to propositional knowing. It's a monophasic mode which says there's only one state of consciousness that gives you access to reality. And it's monologic, that reason is prototypically something you do in your head on your own. And the prototypical example is writing the treatise, right? And of course, Plato violates all of those, right? Plato clearly violates all of those. And so I think it's, so, and the degree to which that historical view of mind is being taken up unquestionably into the project that's called artificial intelligence. This is an argument I've actually made explicitly. I've got to talk about this, about, that we fail to take into account what we are embodying in these machines, that we think we are just, that there's just this thing, almost like a substance intelligence, that we just know what it is and we can put it in. And I particularly think that what's happening in 4E cognitive science is showing, well, the inadequacies of, a very strictly computational, propositional modeling of what intelligence is and intelligence does. So I have a lot to say about that. So you have really, I mean this in a good way. This usually is something meant to be something negative, but I mean it really positively. You pushed a lot of my buttons, and I want to talk about them. So the first thing, go ahead.
Just to say that I'm very interested in the 4E approach and how that is reaching out and where the connections can be made as much as where there might be differences.
Very much. So let's start with I think the wonderful example, because as I indicated, I think Plato clearly violates this cognitive grammar, this cultural cognitive grammar that we have that locks us into this three-dimensional monism of mind, if I can put it that way. And this is a question, that people like Gadamer take up, but also people, and some of these people within the Platonic literature, like Gonzalez and Vervaeke and Drew Hyland, right? Who, and this goes back to Schleiermacher, that the way Plato wrote, the mix of myth and the drama and the dialogue, and not just the argumentation, is actually central to Plato's philosophy. That if you do the project of abstracting the arguments out and then treating that as what philosophers care about in the dialogues, then I think you're missing the Platonic dialogue. And that's why I am so engaged in this project. So let me make this one point, and then I'll turn it back to you. I'm so engaged in this project that I'm calling the project of dialectic, which is the psychotechnology, both intrapersonal and interpersonal, that allows us to realize dialogos. And that takes me to the point, which is the degree to which we can, I don't think we can get back to the Platonic world or anything anachronistic like that, but the degree to which we can reconfigure practices that do what Gadamer calls the bridging of horizons, right? That we set the text within a set of practices that transform us in ways that we can say are at least proportionally analogical to what Plato was talking about, so that not that we see things exactly as Socrates does or Plato does, but what I'm trying to get at, there's a bridging of horizons. There's at least a deep existential resonance possible between us. And so part of what that then brings up, right, is exactly the other Barfieldian point, is how deep is this evolution of consciousness? Is there such a thing? How deep is it? Does it forever make the previous places inaccessible to us, right? Or is there something more like a deep continuity between it? And so that's what I'd like to start exploring with you.
Yeah, well, I mean, just on that last point, and then I'd like to come back to how Plato's working. I mean, I think actually that the last point's relatively straightforwardly answered actually myself, is that Barfield, and I think people like Steiner and so on as well, they have basically a U shape of kind of consciousness development. And so the point is not that older states of perception become completely impenetrable, but that contemplating them actually sparks a kind of new version of them, if you like, that gathers up all that's happened in between times, and so expands the present in relation to the past. Yeah, they're bridges of a sort, but they're kind of I don't know, they have a catalytic quality, I think.
Oh, that's
yeah. So I think the idea is that I don't know. I was reading Roberto Calasso's latest book, The Celestial Hunter. I don't know if you ever read him. He's a wonderful kind of cultural writer, and he writes these long books that weave ancient myth, modern perceptions. Anyway, this one he focuses on the idea of hunting and how the notion of hunting might have changed over time. And he starts off with imagining our Paleolithic ancestors, and the old question of why they painted bison and aurochs and everything on cave walls. And his assumption is that because back then, and this fitted very nicely with the Barfieldian perception of things, there wasn't really a sense of difference between the animal and the human. They were both beings of a sort, maybe spirits of a sort, maybe they could metamorphosize and change. So there was a kind of continuity of being. And so when you went hunting, it was a religious event because it was about a kind of an encounter with being, rather than, say, a modern factory farm, which clearly rests on a very, very different experience between what it is to be human and what it is to eat meat. And I think the point about that imagined past is, can we imagine a new relationship to animals in the present and going into the future, and it feels like that's not a straightforward question to answer at all, but it feels like it's worth doing because it opens up possibilities that if you didn't do the imaginative engagement in the past, you would never begin to conceive, really. You just go around in kind of ever tighter epicycles, trying to stretch what you kind of knew already, maybe bringing in this case a ton of ethics that just makes you feel guilty, doesn't really feel very creative, it's just about managing your exploitation a bit better, perhaps. So so there's something about, I always forget where I started and we go off on one of these riffs, but that business about what, the relationship between the past and the present and so on, anyway, and the U shape that's going on.
So that's interesting because, so first of all, you seem to be resonating with my proposal that you have to engage in a set, what I often call an ecology of transformative practices, in order to read these texts, that you very much, you can't read them just by being informed. Of course you can. I'm not telling people what to do. What I'm saying is, right, you can read, but if you just read them to be informed by the propositions, rather than being transformed by the set of practices that's at least analogous to the set of practices in which they were embedded, then you're actually not going to get what the text is genuinely trying to say. So that seems to be landing okay with you. That's a general idea. Because then I want to link that to the possibility that we might have resources very powerfully at our disposal. Here's how I want to sort of put 4E Cog Sci into dialogue with Barfield. Because I know that part of it is Barfield, he does the philological examination, he looks at certain terms, and he says, notice how, you know, like the term pneuma, right? Which we can either translate as spirit or wind, but we can't mean simultaneously the same thing. And then he uses that as kind of like something like a fossil to argue what like that's been left in language. I think he uses that metaphor a couple of times, right? To try and explicate what the previous state of consciousness is. So let me be clear what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that there haven't been fundamental differences in our cultural cognitive grammar, but I wonder if, and this is why I talk about participatory knowing, I wonder if we're really cut off from participatory knowing. So let me try and explain what I mean. Let's take a look at, and I know you're familiar with a bit of this work here. Let's put together sort of on one hand the work of Lakoff and Johnson, which I've criticized in print, so I'm not like an unquestioning supporter of their work, and then the work of Michael Anderson and Dehane and others. And the idea here is the idea that we also often use many terms that have double meanings without making a clear distinction between them. You know, the classic example of, you know, I attacked your argument, I attacked the castle. One's a very physical thing, but it's not really clearly distinct in people's minds, right? And they sort of bleed between them. And now Lakoff and Johnson have a particular theory about that that's metaphorical, and I think that's inadequate, because what Anderson's idea is, and it's really challenging the sort of chronology, cartography model of the brain. His idea is that we either in biological evolution, but also by Dehane and by Goldman and others, also within our own development, we can do something like exaptation. We can take circuits that that have evolved or have been learned for doing one thing, and we can exact them for doing something else. So notice what I'm doing. I'm doing all of this. I'm doing gesturing. Well, that's because Broca's area, which we originally labeled it as what does language syntax, all originally was for doing fine control and coordination, right? Now, I haven't lost that use of Broca's area, because, see, I'm doing it, but I'm also using it right now when I'm speaking. And is that a metaphorical relation? No. But notice, and this is what Gold and Meadow shows, my use of gesture is not an ornament. Like, there's certain problems I can't solve or solve as well if you prevent me from gesturing. The gesturing is not an ornament. And it's not just a metaphor, right? It's the two things are co-acting together, almost like distributed cognition. And that co-action actually enables me to solve many problems and to learn many things I couldn't solve. Now that seems to me to be something, you know, at least deeply analogous to what Barfield's talking about. But this is not something that we used to do in the past. You're doing it right now. You're gesturing, and you see and that's just one example. Or how, you know, the cerebellum has been exacted from physical balance to managing any complex set of contingencies, and that's why we use it. Well, that's why we use balance when we're talking about justice. We might actually be activating the cerebellum because it's really good at managing the complex interaction between many contingent variables. Again, that's not a metaphor, but it certainly seems to be a different kind of knowing than just propositional. You see what I'm trying to get at? So, so let's be clear one more time. I'm not disputing that there are historical differences in our cultural cognitive grammar. I agree with that. But I'm wondering, you know, it's like, are the stages like Piagetian stages, Junk and Barfield, or is it much more, well, like there's a layering, right? And we still have a lot of participation. In fact, 4E cognitive science is emphasizing, right, how much of our cognition is actually perspectival and participatory and enacted in just the way I'm describing.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a lot. I hope that wasn't too much.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the thought that I have is whether or not Homo sapiens, say, has developed new cognitive methods or not. I'm not sure that's quite a question that Barfield asks. It's more, what has Homo sapiens become more or less aware of over time? It would be more like that. So
go on that. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good.
Yeah. So you know, so for example, if you look back to ancient Athens again, one of the things that's really quite surprising is the amount of time and effort that was put into what we would call religious practices.
Yep.
You know, whether they be personal rituals that shaped all day, every day, and whether they be the great festivals of the city, you know, the extraordinary effort of putting up buildings like the Parthenon, you know, which seem completely excessive compared to anything that we would do now.
Yes.
You know, with no kind of financial return and so on. And so I think you could say, you know, that like 40 or 50% of the activity of an ancient Athenian is more or less incomprehensible to us. It just seems like it would normally call just sort of like superstition. But that seems to me to be not a very satisfactory way of approaching it. And it's a parallel of when you read the Platonic dialogue and think, why is he described, you know, like a whole tenth of this dialogue has got what we would call a near-death experience in it. Why has he bothered doing that? And so for me, the challenge is more, you know, have we really lost perception of a great chunk of the world, if you like? And if that is so, what does that mean now? If you don't just say it's just superstition and, you know, thank God we've shed it all.
Okay, that's really good. So that's really helpful. So let's pick up on this. So it strikes me that the two things then are not actually even, it wasn't even presenting them as in conflict, but they're not even juxtaposed, because it strikes me that a lot of what we're not seeing is what, like, Heidegger called ready to hand. That's what I was talking about. Like, we're not actually seeing the gestural nature of our cognition. We're seeing through it, but we're not aware of it. I mean, so it's there's a large degree in what you're saying is, I mean, in fact, it sounds like they have to correspond to each other. I'm simultaneously losing awareness of aspects of reality in conjunction with losing awareness and identity with various faculties. It doesn't mean those faculties have sort of biologically ceased to exist, you acknowledge that, but that they are not properly taken up into my awareness or into my sense of self. Is that a fair way to sort of try and stitch these two together?
Yeah, maybe it is. I mean, again, perhaps this is just trying to identify what we're talking about, but as you were talking then, actually, a bit of William Blake came to my mind. And this phrase that Blake uses about the doors of perception.
Yeah.
And, you know, this is often now read as a kind of hippie, you know, psychedelic aspiration or hope that somehow something will, you know, come into your mind. I think Blake actually meant it really quite precisely. Because, you know, there's that famous encounter when he was asked what he sees when he sees the sunrise. You know, do you see a fiery ball about the size of a guinea? And he says, no, I see the heavenly host singing, holy, holy, holy. And I think that what he understood was that when he looked through his eyes, he could see a whole lot more because of his acceptance, really, of his imaginative capacities. And that's what it was for him to step through the door. That's why he said doors of perception, not just like windows of perception.
Yeah.
And so there's something about. Well, let me put another example and see what you make of this.
Please.
I mean, I was recently rereading Plato's The Phaedo, you know, which is the one in it where Socrates dies, and I wanted to read it again because death is quite present to many of us right now with the COVID crisis. And I was thinking, you know, what does reading the dialogue in this present moment show me that I maybe wouldn't have seen if I'd read it, you know, 10 years ago? And there was, what I realized was that, well, what I took Plato to be doing was, he realized that if death itself is present, which it literally is in the dialogue, and you know, it's sort of set up in the dialogue because you know that by the end of it, Socrates is going to be dead. He's going to stop breathing. There's going to be a kind of cold, waxy body there. What does that enable you to perceive that you perhaps just couldn't have perceived in any other way?
Right.
So there's something about both our imagination and perhaps our awareness of what's present that sort of takes off in a whole new direction. The possibility there, and I could say more about how I think Plato's Phaedo is actually working there, but maybe that's enough to be going on.
Yeah, that is enough. That's very helpful. So, I mean, so as I said, I was reading this thesis, and you know, Lachman talks about it, and I forget which this book here. You probably read this, Mark. I haven't read it, but it was in the thesis, and so I'm intending to read it. Taking Appearance Seriously, The Dynamic Way of Seeing in Goethe and European Thought by Bartov.
I don't know. I haven't read it actually. No. Yeah.
Yeah, and so this whole this way of seeing, and that's resonant, and you know, and because the what you were talking about there, what came out in the thesis was, you know, how Goethe rejects the Kantian distinction, right? So Kant has, right, sensations are like we're passive in their face, and then thought is spontaneous and free, but right, it has no content. So when it's on its own, it just does empty metaphysics. And sensations, we're completely passive with respect to them, and that passivity actually guarantees their realness, although in Kant it really doesn't, but whatever. And that what Goethe seemed to, and then Goethe seemed to argue, and you probably know more about this than I do, you know, that there's a way of seeing in which that dichotomy between imagination and perception is completely transcended. And what's interesting is, again, that's something that 4E cognitive science, and particularly enacted versions of what's called predictive processing, is showing that the machinery. So let's talk first for sort of, somewhat pedantically, and then let's break it back up to this existential phenomenological level. But pedantically, what it is, you know, the machinery that you engage when you're seeing something, and I mean visual perception, a very similar machinery is being engaged and activated when you're imagining seeing it. And that imagination is, so it's not a separate thing. It's more like the top down. So the metaphor that's now used is bottom up and top down. It's more like the way the top down, you know, sensitizes you, and the bottom up is more how the world is challenging you, and it's much more dialogic. And so the distinction between imagination and perception goes away, such that it makes good sense to say, you know, you should practice doing a lot of imagination because it will actually transform your perception down the road, right? Mm-hmm. Things like that. In fact, I often use that phrase when I'm teaching Tai Chi Chuan. I say we use imagination to train perception, right? And this gets much more to imagination in the imaginal sense rather than the imaginary sense. So I think all of that makes a tremendous amount of sense. And so I guess what to take it back up, when you're reading these things, it seems like what you're now saying is you're trying to, and that's why I brought the book up, you're trying to invoke this way of seeing that it's difficult to realize because we have this cognitive grammar that dichotomizes subjective, objective, imagination, perception, mind and body, me and the world, like all the sort of, but there's a state, if I understand you correctly, that is kind of between, that's even the wrong predicate, it's the wrong adjective, between and beyond, right? There's a way of seeing that's also a way of realizing, it's also a way of sensitizing, it's also a way of attending, that's also a way of conceptualizing, but not as a distinct in your head thing. I think
so, yeah. And I mean, again, the thought that came to mind just when you're talking there is, I don't know. So to bring in something else that I hope is illuminating, you know, in the medieval world, and I think it's even in the ancient world as well, it was quite standard to realize there were kind of several levels of knowing, and
Right.
you'll be familiar with this. You know, there's the literal knowing, the allegorical knowing. But the one that's interesting me now is the tropological, the one where something starts to turn and change,
Yes, yes.
and to gain the kind of anagogic perception.
Yeah, exactly.
And yeah, so. I suppose the other thought I have is that I wonder how it's interesting to track, as you say, the kind of the various cognitive systems, and I noticed the metaphors of the machine sort of come in and so on, and see how there are parallels and how they're even the same. But in terms of your perception of the world, things can be completely different. You know, dramatically transformed, and so for me it becomes a kind of metaphysical question as well, which is you know, you take something like death. You know, death can be something about which you can't think what to say at all. It's bewildering, you know, and so you get a certain kind of analytical philosopher will say, well, you know, why are you even worried about death? You weren't worried about being alive before you were born, so why would you worry about not being alive after you died? You know, which feels like it completely misses the point. Although I know it satisfies some people, but maybe it satisfies them because they have to stay in a certain level of kind of awareness. And then you might get a second level which says that you know, death must be kind of avoided at all costs. I can feel it's a real thing. It's a kind of, it's a monstrosity, and you know, we'll use all medical science. You know, we're trying to build computers that we can load ourselves onto, whatever it might be. You know, to try and avoid it. That might be another level. A third level might be, I don't know, death as the kind is a terrible tragedy, and it intensifies life because of the tragic experience of it. We want to sort of celebrate the lives of people we've known. That, you know, this is very different from saying death is nothing at all. But then you might get the kind of anagogic level, which would say, well, actually, you know, treating death as just a kind of moment at the end of your life, that's the mistake.
Yes.
That life is a continual, was, as T.S. Eliot put it, you know, the time of death is every moment. Yes. And the reason why that is appealing is not just because it reconciles you to death, but because you realize that it's constant stepping into new life.
Yes.
Now that is a very different perception from, you know, well, certainly from the silence. And, you know, this matters, I think, because people, it completely changes people's lives.
Yes.
And you know, and I think you can even say there are kind of different outputs that this arises from. Like, for example, Plato's Phaedo. I think if Plato hadn't himself had that perception, which, you know, by the end of the dialogue, I think basically has Socrates saying, look, if you sit before death and try and come up with your arguments that say you survive beyond death and watch them fall, which is essentially what happens for the first sort of 2/3 of the dialogue. And they say, you know, maybe the soul floats off from the body. Well, no, that doesn't make sense. You know, maybe the soul is like the music and the lyre, but you still need the lyre. You know, they have all these kind of, and all of them fall, so much that they kind of reach a panic, you know, just over halfway through, thinking, my God, you know, the greatest philosopher who's ever lived is about to be unable to answer the greatest question, even as he's about to die. But it's that kind of, that precipitous moment that becomes tropological. And eventually, you know, I think in a way, in a nutshell, what Socrates is saying, look, now what I see is I never possessed life to start with. It possessed me. And, you know, my intelligence was just a sharing in the divine logos, say, you know, so at every moment that I've let go of my own perception of my life, I've been stepping into that wider perception. So now that I'm about to die, that is just continuing what's been going on all my life anyway. He's trying to say something like that. And the truth of that, I mean, I've tried to express it in, you know, sentences, but I think the truth that ultimately is something that is felt. Yeah. That you know it directly, and I know you. I mean, you know, you're very much onto this, of course. but yeah, so how do I get to all that point? Yeah, it's about this. It's not just how can we understand cognitive processes, if you like.
Of course.
It's about what do we actually, again, I suppose I've said this, what do we actually perceive? That's why I think I'm ultimately interested in this evolution of consciousness, because I want it to sort of, as it were, expand, enable me to step through the doors of perception, if you like. Yeah.
So that's great. I mean that. That's really good. I like that. I mean, I've actually been teaching in my meditation class, teaching to the Sangha Alexia Divina, this way of reading that is not about information. It's about transformation, and it's about and the goal is sort of right relationship with being and with yourself, rather than having the right answer, which is a very different thing. And I think what you're talking about is, the Phaedo, if read properly, because I think all of the arguments for the immortality of the soul, they're all deeply questionable. And the ones that Plato says, well, they might work, they're not what we typically want in immortality. They're not personal immortality. They're sort of maybe that part of you that conforms to eternal truths is eternal. So in that sense, it's not going to answer, right? It's not going to give you the right answer. But I think what you're saying is, it's more like, and I've been wrestling with this idea, around faith, about the idea of, being faithful to reality, entering into right relationship with it, and transforming. And I did not intend, and I don't think you read it that way, but just to be clear, I did not intend the cognitive science to be exclusive and to say this is, what I was trying to say is, could we, instead of these two discourses taking place separately from each other, I think they come together precisely in, as I said, that this new way of seeing is a new way of being, and that gets me into, right, that there's a connection, but there's a self-knowledge, there's a self-knowing. And so knowing more about knowing, and again, not just in the propositional sense, but in the kind of knowing that affords right relationship, that perspectival and participatory transformation, I think that can only help. So that I wasn't, and
I completely get that. Yeah, and I mean that's precisely why you're developing the 4E approaches and so on.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the ultimate motivation, at least for many of the people that I know or see, especially those who come out of the Heideggerian tradition, that the ultimate motivation for this isn't just scientific, but it's ultimately existential. It's ultimately about, can we transform our accounts of what it is to know the world and know ourselves in such a way that we can undergo and afford that kind of transformation you're talking about in a response to nihilism. I mean, I think the cultural undercurrent of a lot of 4E cognitive science is the meaning crisis. They're coming into prominence of nihilism. And I often use, you're right, I often use the machine metaphor because that's the language I was taught. But I would say that, for example, this is a classic point of 4E, that we have to ultimately think about not machines, at least in the Newtonian sense. We have to think about autopoietic adaptive. We have to think about living things, that our primary models shouldn't be mechanical in the physics sense. They should be biological models, that there's a deep continuity. And so even there, that's relevant to this, because you mentioned that, the issue about what's getting left out in artificial intelligence. I think both below and above is being left out. What I mean by that is, because of this, the Three Manos, we're leaving out, I think, really good work, theory and data, evidence that's mounting that you're not going to get anything like intelligence, artificial intelligence, unless it is grounded, bound up with autopoietic, adaptive, autonomous life. To put it in a kind of a little bit oversimplistic statement, but artificial intelligence will depend on artificial life. It's missing below. It's also missing above. You don't want to give a system just artificial intelligence. You don't want to just give it the capacity for being a general problem solver. Because although general intelligence predicts a lot of things, you know what it only weakly predicts? It only weakly predicts your capacity for dealing with self-deception, for overcoming the way in which your problem-solving techniques deceive you and cut you off from yourself, your projects in the world. So we have to also go above. We need what I would call, and I don't mean just logical argumentation by this, you know that I don't mean that. We need artificial rationality as well as artificial, like you're only going to get artificial intelligence if it's sandwiched between artificial life, really deeply meant. I don't mean just a mechanical body, I mean artificial life and artificial rationality. And so I think I think that the attempt to make artificial intelligence is actually systematic. Maybe you'll like this. Is that the way it's currently being pursued, although it's being challenged by all the stuff I just said, all the 4E stuff, right? Is very much is symptomatic of the kind of metaphysics that has produced nihilism. So even if I have my you've seen the technical questions I've had about computation, relevance realization. I have all of those, but even outside of that scientific kind of critique, I think this is becoming apparent, and that's where the scientific critique blends back into a cultural critique, which is the way you're conceptualizing this, which is really subject to, I think, very powerful scientific critique, is also bound up with a metaphysics of mind, a metaphysics of self-knowledge, a metaphysics of being that is actually exacerbating the meaning crisis.
Yeah. So a thought in response. I mean, I feel very conducive to that. And the thought that occurred to me is how, you know, what you were talking about, the above and below. I think when you get these kind of tropological moments, and you see this in psychotherapy, in my own practice, let alone just by sort of personal observation or personal practices, is that moments of real change, that whole thing, as it were, comes together. It's both both an embodied moment and a kind of shift of consciousness.
Yes.
You know, it's a eureka moment. It's not incidental that Archimedes, you know, leaps out of the bath and runs down the street. That is not incidental to his shift of consciousness in that moment, I think.
Exactly, because the fact that he does it means also there's been a shift in what's salient, even his self-image, even his public persona. All of that has now been radically reskewed. Yeah, totally. I think that moment when you get right, and that's what I mean when I'm trying to talk about that dialectic isn't just, it's importantly interpersonal, but it's also intrapersonal in getting that stack right, like you just did, you know. That when all of those things click together this way, that you and I are clicking together this way, right? And there's a third thing that opens up between them. This is work that Chris and I are doing. Like when this, if you'll allow me these gestural metaphors right, and this are starting to mutually afford and resonate, then a third sort of opens up between them, and that is, I think, that's kind of like the anagogic field. That's where, right, because this is exactly happening. When you have the horizontal and the vertical, then you afford it anagoge in a powerful, powerful way. And that's what I'm interested in, because I think there's a whole network of practices. Don't forget, Socrates is also going to the gymnasium. That's just taken for granted, right? He's done martial arts, literally. That's also taken for granted. He's done music. That's taken for granted. Right? And so there's all of this stuff and all these practices. And then trying to get at, you know, well, can I understand what dialectic is so that I can read the dialogues dialectically so that that third factor opens up?
Yeah.
It won't be, I'm not claiming what it will be for me is exactly what it would be in Plato's place, but I think there's a proportional analogy between them, so that I'm reading Plato at least in a deeply transformative, deeply relevant manner, other than just whether or not I'm going to agree with certain propositions.
So let me add something then, because I think that another thing that spiritual intelligence would add, again, to put it rather crudely, but would be that, those topological moments are also receptive moments, put it like that. the reason why they change you is not because suddenly, as it were, your neurons reorganize and another fantasy becomes possible, but because you become more resonant with wider reality.
Oh, totally.
You know, so actually, let me just reach for a book if I can just find it quickly.
Yeah, well, I did that. Of course you should.
Yeah. So we talked last time about Gregory Shaw's book on theology and the soul.
Oh, that's an excellent book.
You know, which is such a book. I wonder whether you'd seen this one actually. Our Divine Double.
I talk about it. I've read it. I talk about it repeatedly in the series. I
have. I'm an idiot. Then I didn't have the perceptual tools to notice. I've only just read it myself. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
No.
I mean, I thought it was a really fascinating book. I've only just come across it, and but this idea of the divine double seemed to me to be one way of thinking about how it's a reception of intelligence, you know, experience and so on, as rather than the sort of the self, maybe fabrication or something, or you know, in the richest, but then in the poiesis sense, the autopoiesis sense. But all that autopoiesis has to happen, but ultimately, in order that, you know, the metaphor might be, you know, that like a tuning in the radio or something, that more frequency can come down or whatever it might be.
But that's exactly one of the main. Okay, so first of all, I talk about divine double a lot in the episodes, and I try to integrate it with Agnes Keller's work on aspiration.
Okay, well, I'll have to go and listen all again. It's funny what you're doing here.
I talk about it. It even comes up on one of the book, the panels. His stuff on Dionysus, I highly recommend as well. Dionysus, the Areopagite. But let's go this point about attunement and resonance. But that's exactly, again, I don't want to sound like I'm just beating a drum, but this is one of the central moves that 4E cognitive science is trying to say. That your mind isn't in your head, right? The mind is primary. Well, you know, it's cognition is actually the ongoing attunement, the evolving attunement between you and the world. It's co-created by you and the world. That's what I mean about that's going back to the Goethe. It's not just spontaneous projection. It's not just passive reception. It's the two are right. The resonance picks up on both of those. That's what I've been trying to get at with the whole notion of transjectivity. That right, you're and I think that's what Goethe was talking about. Like you're simultaneously reaching out with how the autopoetic change has afforded you a new way of seeing. But that is inseparably bound up with a new way in which the world is disclosing itself to you and challenging you. And you can't separate those at all. It's not in your head. It's not in the world. It's between you and the world in a fundamental way, which I think is like what you were also doing with the confrontation with death. It's not like well, now I'm immune to death. I'm sort of like this. And it's not like, oh, I'm just going to pass. It's again, you're entering into the right relationship, right? And you're getting different aspects to disclose themselves to you. So this is one of the fundamental. That's what the embedded, and extended.
Yeah, okay. That's really helpful. That fleshes it out for me. Thank you. Yeah.
The attunement metaphor, right, and that cognition is much more a self-organizing process of attuning yourself to the environment. That it's often happening sub-representationally, sub-propositionally, than it is inside your head. You're running all these calculations, and then you're just sending out motor commands and receiving sensory postcards from your senses or something like that. Mm-hmm. It's a very, very different view. It's deeply embedded, deeply embedded.
So, I mean, that the book, The Divine Double, is, you'll know, that talks a lot about, ends up talking a lot about Plotinus.
Yeah, I have him tattooed on my leg, man.
All right, okay. So one of the things I really enjoyed about the book was that the seeming metaphysics in Plotinus about the one becoming two and so on. I took him to saying this really should be understood as a myth, and the difference there would be is that it's a way of trying to capture the experience of being part of this emergence from the one as well. Yeah. So I really like that.
Yeah. So one of the things that's exemplary for me about Plotinus is again how all of these dimensions that I talked about in dialectic are present. So when you're reading Plotinus, you're reading an argument, but you're also going through a spiritual exercise. I mean, Spinoza is similar too, right? But in Plotinus, it's so, and the interweaving of argumentation and conceptual analysis, that's a bit of an anachronism because he doesn't do analysis, but something like that, working with, conceptual intelligibility. And then the invoking of transformative practices. So for, that's why it's on my list. It starts with, it goes basically theory, ecstasis, hypnosis, theoria, right? There's no deep distinction between theorizing and theoria. And then, and then Proclus comes on and adds on, and also theurgia, right? And so those three are just, yeah. And so when you're,
so that, see, that's in
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so in Plato's Phaedo, the reason why the arguments for the immortality of the soul fail is precisely so you can have the kenosis.
Yes.
To the more sort of flatter, rational mind, it looks like a failure, it looks like a disaster, and those around Socrates start to panic a bit. And then they realize that there's something that's absolutely crucial about that happening to come to this kenotic moment that's leading to the... We've been jumping around a bit. I don't know quite where we got to on that. Did you?
Yeah, I
get that.
Just say the last thing you said. The last 30 seconds.
So, no, I was just really what I was doing was jumping in and saying, this is, as it were, the anagogic realization about the way the dialogue, the Phaedo, is functioning. That what seemed at first like a crisis of rationality, like it can't answer the big question about life and death. In the middle point of the dialogue, they realize it's the kenotic moment.
Yes.
Like in Plotinus, and it's actually necessary that it happens. In a way, the reason itself has to kind of die in order that this new perception can have the space to come through. Yeah.
So for Plotinus, and I think Plotinus argues it's continuous with Plato. Of course, there's Platonic scholars that disagree with that, but I think there's real continuity. I think there's a real tradition there. When we talk about there being a tradition within the Catholic Church or the Eastern Orthodox Church. Doesn't mean they're identical, but there's a deep continuity and a tradition binding them together. I dislike the way the Neoplatonists are often dismissed.
I mean, I agree. I think that the evolution of consciousness idea helps me understand that, because it took, as it were, 5-6 centuries for what had begun to become clear to Plato to really become clear for Plotinus, which is precisely the one. It's kind of obvious. Plato can talk about the good, beautiful, and the true, and wonder about how they all relate, and do they kind of is there any one form at the end of the day, as it were? But it's only becomes possible for Plotinus to really see it, and to therefore begin to articulate it in the way that he does.
And what Plotinus constantly reminds and exemplifies and affords is that realization is something that can't be undertaken just within dianoia, right? It can't be taken just within discursive reasoning. He's not anti-intellectual. That would be a big mistake, right? He says, and so he's internalized it. The point is, you take the discursive reasoning as far as it will go, because it's like what you did with door. It's not a window you look at, it's a portal that portends, that transports you into something beyond. And so what you have, and then what Plotinus does is, well, it's like in the Republic. Yeah, you go out, but he constantly goes up to or out to the sun, but then he returns, right? He returns back to the text, back to the argument. So, right, there's that constant movement back and forth between theoria, that gets you into hypnosis, and theorizing, and I find that really, really exemplary in a very powerful way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's often missed, but it is in there in Plato again. I think partly because the details are often read over. But the Republic, for example, well known for the myth of the cave, which seems like an ascending metaphor, but of course its opening words are "I went down to Piraeus." So the whole point is right from the word go. The two are interwoven.
Totally. And so that's wonderful, because that affords me circling back to something. So returning to the cave, and then this sort of resonates with something else, right? For an oft repeated, and I think therefore it might be getting a little bit cliched, and I want to try and revitalize it. Thing from Zen is, when I first started studying Zen, mountains were mountains and rivers were rivers. And then when I was doing Zen, mountains weren't mountains and rivers weren't rivers. And then when I was done Zen, mountains were mountains and rivers were rivers. But that although it's the same, it's also totally different than the first time, right? And so that brings me around to, you return back into the cave, you go through disclosing aspects of the world, but the point isn't for them ultimately to be special or different or weird, right? And this is what this thing's the Plotinus. The point is, like, you go out, but you also have to know how to come back in.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, so this is a different. I mean, I think that's true of Plotinus, and again, another thing that's often not remembered about Plotinus is that he was quite active in politics. He even wanted to build a city named after him and all that kind of thing. Maybe put this so slightly differently. So bring in a bit of Dante here, because it reminded me of Dante with the descent and the ascent, because of course the whole of the Divine Comedy is structured on a descent and then an ascent. And I think that, again, the more I read it, the more I realise that a descending moment is also an ascending moment.
Yes.
And it's something about so to put it sort of psychologically, I think it's not until Dante has descended to to the point where he can't really descend any further, because otherwise he would, in a Neoplatonic sense, he would just sort of drop out of being altogether. Right. But he does that because then he becomes increasingly aware of what, as it were, lies outside of the descent, that holds and contains what he is descending into. So that's partly, he realizes the extent of his own darkness, which at first feels overwhelming, but then gives him this sense that, for Dante, as actually as well for modern psychotherapy, that the love that keeps things in motion is actually bigger than the hate or whatever else that would stop these things turning over and that would trap people.
I see.
But I think there's something also again about the tropological, the enantiodromia moment, as Jung will put it. Because it's very striking that in the narrative, at least, which of course has a narrative as well as things repeating in every moment, they don't find their way out of hell by sort of, as it were, walking back the way they came. And they find their way out of hell by climbing onto Satan's body. It's very dramatic, and suddenly Dante realizes, even as they're on, Satan's left buttock or something, that they're now actually, they started to ascend, even as they're still climbing across Satan's body. And I think, there is a deep psychological truth about that. Donald Winnicott, who we mentioned before, who I'm very influenced by, I think he understood these things. And he did make comments like, you can't really know about love until you know about the extent of hate. You can't really know about interdependence until you know about the relationship between competition and cooperation. Again, you mentioned thirds, and I love the idea of thirds appearing. This would be another way of putting it would be the conjunction of opposites. For the new possibility. So that's at least one take, I think, on what you're talking about there. And again, it's the point is that it is literally imperceptible until you've gone on the journey. But once you've gone on it, to come back to your point, the world. I think you've seen, the mountain and the river far more extensively. I would put that, but you are, with the mountain and the river,
right?
Something like that, I would say.
It's something like, I think that the more expansive or the deeper seeing was always That's not a new thing about the mountain and the river. Nor is it a new thing about you. There's the idea, that you don't ultimately achieve Buddha nature, right? That's the wrong way of thinking about it. That's a difficult one to wrestle with. But I think part of what they're trying to get at is this sense of, and this is very clear, because Plotinus argues the whole structure of reality is like that. That the procession from the one and the return from one, these are not historical moments. Right?
Yeah, that's what we're putting it. Yeah.
Yeah, these are eternal. These are eternal structures, right? That are the grounding principles. I'm struggling for words here. For intelligibility and being itself, because the one is beyond being, in an important way. So I take it that that's what they're trying to get at. That notion.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I think there are parallel experiences in psychotherapy. So, someone might come to you and, with very tangible struggles with life of one sort or another, and you go through a long process of engagement with that. Maybe it needn't be quite so long as sometimes it is. We are learning how to get the body more involved and so on. There's no doubt about that.
Right.
But nonetheless, a long old process, say. And sure enough, things change. But then you ask the person, so what made the difference? And they might say to you something like, well, I just know myself a bit better.
Yeah.
And you think, but why did it take so long? But it takes a long time just to know yourself sort of marginally better.
Yes.
But that, in a way, that marginal difference means that, for example, the anxiety or something has a whole load more space to be held within, and so lessens and so decreases.
I would imagine that it also means that aspects of the world are now disclosed to them, and possibilities of relating are now disclosed to them that weren't available to them before.
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to get at what it means when people say, what changes, they no longer feel stuck, right?
Yeah. I mean, you might be that people trust parts of their experience more.
Right.
They know, and particularly their embodied experience, they know it's got meaning. It's not just incidental. I think their experience of time expands.
Right.
Yeah, and again, that's another thing that is really crucial in Dante, is that he starts to realize that all the souls in hell don't have a present moment. They're fixated on the past or the future.
Right.
And of course, it's in the present moment that change is possible. Which is another thing that's deeply embedded in spiritual practices, of course. The Zen question, what is this, or something like that, and trying to collapse onto the present moment. So I think time changes. I think just the sort of trust in life actually as well changes, that people are prepared to, they're more able to disidentify with a narrow sense of self and identify with a wider sense of flow in life, for example.
Right.
Yeah, so that's an extended mind idea, I guess.
Yeah. Sounds very much like it is. Very much.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're almost out of time, so maybe we
can
talk about these things again. So, what you're trying, like as I said before we started recording, I have sort of issues with the idea of the use of the term intelligence here. Although I think you're trying to use it the way Plotinus used intellection, which is a very different thing from our modern meaning of intelligence.
Yeah.
I'm not very happy with that terminology, which is not to say, again, that I'm disputing the phenomena that you're referring to. And so, but is the capacity for undergoing this, is the capacity for, and I don't want to say doing it, participating, right? This moment of transition where you move into anagoge and things are opened up. Is the capacity you're trying to put your finger on with the term spiritual intelligence? Is that what you're putting your finger on with that term? Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, I think it would be one way into a kind of cluster of elements, say, that you've say you come across routinely in figures like Plotinus. So, for example, another one would be simplicity.
Yeah.
And one thing that the tropological, the kenotic moment moves into when it moves into the anagogic is also what Plotinus would call simplicity. And that's not a breaking down into parts. It's precisely the opposite, where the whole has a kind of cogency that can be seen now, can be experienced. The kind of, say, the ecology of the cosmos might be able to be perceived. The experience, another way of putting it would be subspecies eternitatis.
Yeah.
There's a kind of, a timeless view of the moving images of eternity. As Blake puts it, I love Blake's expression, eternity is in love with the productions of time. Yeah. Knowing what that really is about. So there would be, the tropological would certainly be part of it, but I think the idea of a unity, a simplicity would be really important, which again, they have their parallels in spiritual practices. In the non-dual sense of disidentifying with the turnover of thoughts and becoming more identified with the awareness itself, the presence itself. I think that it's that kind of cluster. The phrase spiritual intelligence, which I agree with you is, it's only used because there's artificial intelligence. So it's just to try and suggest we're trying to tease something out here, that maybe isn't captured, certainly by regular problem solving artificial intelligence.
I'm interested in that state, because, a person who invoked it a lot, of course, is, Spinoza, especially the Latin version that you just quoted, under the eye of eternity, but that's correlative to co-determining with, scientia intuitiva, which is, again, this, because the simplicity, as you said, it doesn't mean homogeneity, and it doesn't mean singularity, because, the one is also, the pregnancy for all of the forms and for all of the instantiation, right? And so, it's more like, it's intuitiva, prajna, right? There's a lot of, it goes back to what we were saying about this way of seeing in which, each part, you see the whole in each part, and you see, right, the part in terms of the whole, like there's a complete interpenetration of the parts and the whole. That's what it is in Spinoza. And again, this comes back to the new way, like when you're reading the ethics, and it's very tempting because you're reading, here's a theorem and here's an act, and you're reading through all this argument, and you can just get caught up in the sequence. But what happens is you get to a moment where you get it, like, and you see, and then you see each premise in terms of the whole argument, and then you see the whole argument, right, impregnating each premise, and you get scientia intuitiva, and that's more what Spinoza's after than any of the particular conclusions. And you get that moment, and it's a really, really powerful moment. And so, like, I think, I'm very interested in that. Sorry, that makes it sound like a specimen. I don't mean it that way at all, right? I am interested in as a cognitive scientist, but I'm deeply, Alia Sophia, I'm deeply in love with what is it? What is the capacity within us and the corresponding capacity in being that affords this, that makes this possible for us? That's a question I keep circling back to again and again and again and again. And again, not in thought, but what are the practices that go with the thoughts that make me sensitive to this affordance?
Yeah, so look, well, here's another thought that I wonder how it fits in, because I think another key thing that spiritual intelligence, for want of a better expression, would say, which again comes from many different wisdom traditions, is that you actually know something better by loving it than just by kind of knowing it.
Yeah, well, very much.
Yeah.
I have that in front of me. When I email you, you can see at the bottom. Knowing and loving is its own way of knowing. Yeah, but it's exactly that. It's loving as the reciprocal opening, the enacted anagoge. Yeah, definitely.
But in terms of the experience of that, is it means that your stance towards life is one of more about noticing and waiting and anticipating and intentionally moving towards that the love enables you to do, rather than being able to sort of conjuring up or hold on to, possess, whatever, you know.
That's why.
Yeah.
No, sorry, I interrupted. I didn't mean to.
No, I made the point. You know, it's again a bit of, you know, it's Blake's lovely expression: "He who binds to himself the joy does the winged life destroy. He who kisses the joy as it flies lives in eternity's sunrise."
Yeah.
That kind of shift, which take a lifetime to really live, of course.
but you know, this goes back to the off. This goes back, you know, this kind of knowing by loving, which is, I think, the most important way in which we bring wisdom into participatory knowing. I think that's exactly right. Yeah, I mean, and that's, again, that's the faithfulness you have when you're in love with somebody. Like, you're not trying to force something on them. You're not trying to come to a conclusion about them. If you have any sense of finality, and that you know you've got them, I got you now. I know what you are. You've doomed that relationship. It's done, right? It's done. It's over. That's when contempt comes in, and there's nothing that ends it. I mean, relationships can come back from betrayal and anger, right? But man, trying to get a relationship to come back from contempt, that is really, really hard. That is really, really hard. Well, you know that better than I.
No. Well, you're saying you don't want to know them, basically. So.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I think you're exactly right.
Yeah, maybe just one more element that I think is quite important, just apart from, because it's come to my mind, is also the notion of freedom in this, and how and the notion of freedom changes. Because it's, you know, it's very striking when you first read spiritual traditions, that it feels like they describe freedom in the opposite way that you would think it. You know, so for example, freedom is described as service, or freedom is described as submission, or freedom is described as a yoke. And yet, again, after this tropological moment, what you realize is that it's a yoke because you've yoked yourself to the place that's truly free, if you like. And all your previous ideas about freedom, say to do with choice or whatever it might be, were sort of poor and lesser notions of freedom. But again, there's got to be a kind of sight, a perception that the good, the beautiful, and the true, to use the Platonic terms, is the place of true freedom, that you want to align with, that you want to die towards, you want to submit, as it were. So again, all these things which felt so difficult and weird and just completely nonsensical before start to make some sense.
I don't know if you've read Frankfurt's book, Reasons for Love.
And the idea that, you know, that in love, which he calls a voluntary necessity, because he's, you know, the way he's playful with words, without bullshitting. One thing Frankfurt's never going to do is bullshit you, right? Right? He's covered that one.
Because I'll often say to people, because when people typically talk about freedom of the will, they're talking about that second thing that you mentioned. They're talking about freedom of choice, and I'm unconstrained, and I can do whatever I wish. And I say, well, what I actually want is I want my thoughts to be as determined as possible by what's true, my actions by what's good, and my sensibility by what's beautiful. And if I could get it so that I was completely determined, you know, obviously I'm undermining the use of the word though, right? I'm determined by what's true and what's good and beautiful in love, that would be for me blessedness. People often like, what? Because I think the notion of freedom that is talked about a lot, and that you're calling into question, I think very important, that is ultimately a purely instrumental notion of freedom. And then you're moving to a different sense of freedom, which is not instrumental. It's about that voluntary necessity, the fact that I feel absolutely no compulsion, but I'm also simultaneously completely conforming to something beyond myself.
Yeah, which is it's creative, you might say. It's again in the Platonic say it's the overflow. It's that kind of almost can't help itself kind of freedom.
Exactly. I like that notion. Layman Pascal uses that. He talks about the overflow, and that is ultimately, as you rightly point out, that's a metaphor for Plotinus. That's one of his favorite metaphors for the one. It overflows itself. It overflows, and it's not in any way being compelled, because nothing compels the one. But nevertheless, it can't not do it. There's a voluntary necessity in its overflow. I think that's exactly right. And when we most emulate that, we are coming into conformity with a I mean, Plotinus would argue, we're coming into conformity with the guts of reality in a profound kind of way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, look, I mean, I feel that we've had an echo of that in this conversation, because it's about trying to, you know, I feel like the conversation, and I appreciate what you're doing, because in a way, I think you're trying to be seriously in the service of reality, of experience. You're not trying to, you know, confine it, trap it. You are trying to engage with it more richly. And that's why practices and dialogues and so on are absolutely part of the exercise, as much as trying to do the more, you know, intellectual work, or the, you know, the experimental work and so on.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. Because, thank you for saying that. That's very encouraging to me, because what you just articulated is, whether or not I achieve it is one thing, but it is clearly what I aspire to. It's clearly what I aspire to. So thank you, Mark. I deeply appreciate you saying that. And I wanted to say, like, the discussion with you, I mean, it's for me one of the sort of the touchstones of true dialogos is two people get to a place they couldn't get to individually on their own, and you bring insight. Like, there was, like, you bring insight and every, like, wow, like I have all those moments with you, and so I really appreciate that. I find talking with you tremendous. Well, I feel like, like you said, I feel like I'm in an acting reciprocal opening while I'm talking with you.
Yeah, well, thank you. And very practically, I appreciated it with this project at Cambridge in the back of my mind, because I think it's going to help me find a third position in a way to relate to all that. So it's not like one versus the other. It's much more, how can these two conversations in a way find the moments of connection that then reveals a third that's beyond both conversations in a way.
Excellent. That's exactly what I would want to have afforded in some way. That's great.
Well, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I would, if you would like, I would like to have you back on again at some point in the future. I feel like like Sart says, we're just abandoning the conversations. We don't finish them. I think there's much more. There's much more I want to. There's much more richness there. Much moreness and suchness that I wanted to. You know, really explore with you. So I'd love to have you back on again at some point.
Well, when you love a subject, there's always more to say.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that's exactly it. There's no closure. There's no closure. There's no closure in love. There's no closure in love.
Yeah.
Well,
thanks.
Well, that'd be great.
I'm delighted to come back. Delighted to. Yeah, thank you.
Okay.